The Disneyland Resort may seem to be the happiest place on Earth, but is it really? For some unfortunate people, they experience the most unhappiest place on Earth. In this video, I will be going over the 28 deaths that had occurred at the park from 1955 to 2023. The first documented death that happened at the Disneyland park was of Mark Maples, a 15-year-old Stanford Junior High School student who was visiting the park in May 1964. Mark decided to ride the Matterhorn. While on the ride, Mark would stand up on the bobsled while the ride was in motion, which caused him to fall out of the ride to the ground below, which severely injured him. Mark would die from his injuries 3 days later. An investigation of this incident found that Mark's restraint was unbuckled by a companion. On June 17, 1966, Thomas Cleveland, a 19-year-old from Northridge, California, was attempting to sneak into one of Disneyland's graduation night events by climbing up to the park's monorail track. Once Thomas successfully climbed up to the monorail tracks, a security guard was shouting warnings to Thomas of a monorail approaching him. He ignored the security guard's warnings. Thomas was struck fatally by the train, which dragged him 30 to 40 feet down the monorail track. In August 1967, Ricky Lee Yama, a 16-year-old boy from Hawthorne, California, was riding the People Movers attraction, since there were no seatbelts or safety railings on this ride. Someone could climb out of the attraction easily. Ricky ignored the safety instructions for the ride, and he jumped out of the ride as it was passing through a tunnel. Ricky slipped and fell onto the tracks when he attempted to jump to the other train of cars. Ricky was crushed and killed when the car's wheels ran him over, which caused his body to be dragged a few hundred feet by the cars. The ride was stopped when the operator noticed the body of Ricky. In 1968, which was a year after the incident on this ride, each of the 62 trains were installed with safety railings to prevent guests from climbing out. However, another similar incident like this would occur 13 years later. On June 20th, 1973, Bogdan Delaroe, an 18-year-old New York resident who was traveling with his younger 10-year-old brother Dorian Delaroe, decided to stay on Tom Sawyer's Island, past the park's closing time by jumping over a fence and hiding in the woods behind the burning settler's cabin. The brothers spent a few hours on the island until later at around 9:30. The brothers felt like leaving the island to head for the main park, since the brothers didn't want to be caught by staff or security. The brothers felt like swimming across to the park would be the best option. Since Dorian didn't know how to swim, Bogdan carried his younger brother across the river. Bogdan slipped and drowned halfway through the waters. However, Dorian was able to keep himself afloat by dog paddling until a staff boat spotted him, and he was rescued. Park security, Anaheim police, and firefighters spent the whole night looking for Bogdan. The body of Bogdan was found the next morning near some fake rocks on the island. One of the most infamous deaths at the park to date, on July 8, 1974, Deborah Gale Stone, who was an 18-year-old who recently graduated from Santa Ana High School. She was a new employee for the park, and she worked as a hostess, greeting people and welcoming them to the America Sings attraction. The ride was designed like a carousel, as the platform would rotate around 6 different segments. Unfortunately, Deborah stood too close towards the area between the rotating theater wall and the non-moving stage wall. Deborah was screaming, crushed, and killed instantly. Daniel Robison, who was on the attraction at the time, witnessed Deborah being pulled between the platform and the wall and heard her loud scream. After Deborah's death, the attraction was closed for 2 days, as safety lights were installed for ride operators whenever someone got too close to the danger area, and eventually the solid walls would be replaced with breakaway walls to prevent similar accidents on this attraction from happening in the future. On August 14, 1979, Cheryl Hoffman, a 31-year-old woman who was traveling with her family when they chose to ride Space Mountain. During the ride, Cheryl became sick, and when the cart arrived at the unloading area, she was unable to exit her seat. Employees told Cheryl to stay in the cart. However, the ride operators were unaware of what was going on with her, so they accidentally sent her through the ride a second time. Once the train arrived at the unloading area again, Cheryl was in a semi-conscious state. Cheryl was taken to Palm Harbor Hospital, where she would remain in a coma and would pass away from her illness 1 week later. Doctors discovered a tumor in Cheryl's heart, and it was likely that the jolt from the ride must have dislodged it, which led to the fragments traveling up to her brain and lodging there, which led to her death. Cheryl's family attempted to file a lawsuit against Disney, however the case was dismissed. On June 7, 1980, another death would occur on the People Movers attraction 13 years after Ricky's death. Gerardo Gonzalez, an 18-year-old man, was riding the attraction when he decided to jump out of the car to hop on the other car as it passed through the tunnel. Just like Ricky, Gerardo would be crushed and killed by the other car, dragging his body a few hundred feet across the ride's track before being stopped by the ride's operator. The first murder to occur at Disneyland took place on March 7, 1981. Mel Yorba, who was an 18-year-old, was hanging out with his group of friends who were heavily intoxicated. When the group made their way to Tomorrowland, Mel would get himself involved in a violent altercation with James O'Driscoll after allegedly pinching the rear end of his girlfriend. Mel would be stabbed twice in the chest by James. When the Disneyland nurse came to Mel's aid, she wasn't allowed to call the paramedics because of a rule where you couldn't call paramedics because it would disturb the peace of the park. The nurse did the best she could to treat Mel. He was taken to a nearby hospital in an unmarked van, while the nurse was driving normally with no emergency lights to the Palm General Hospital. Mel would later die from his injuries a short time later. James would attempt to flee the crime scene by throwing the knife into the castle's moat, and then throwing away his blood-soaked shirt in a woman's restroom trash can, and then he would go into hiding for 90 minutes until authorities discovered him in a bush. James was charged with second-degree murder and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Mel's family filed a lawsuit for $60 million against Disney. In 1986, the jury found Disney negligent for not providing Mel with proper medical treatment, and as a result, the Yorba family won a $600,000 judgment. On April 16, 1981, Janet Wallace, who was a 34-year-old woman, was visiting the park with her husband and 4 children. Janet was standing in line to purchase popcorn near the Sleeping Beauty Castle on Main Street when she suddenly collapsed, and she was transported to the Palm Harbor General Hospital by 2 park nurses in an unmarked van, where she would die 45 minutes later after her arrival. The cause of Janet's death is unknown, but it was possibly caused by a heart attack. Disneyland was often criticized by health officials for not allowing ambulances and marked emergency vehicles in the park when it was necessary to save a life, because park officials felt it would upset the guests and ruin the magic of the park. On June 4, 1983, Philip Strowan was an 18-year-old from Albuquerque who recently graduated from St. Pius X High School. Philip was visiting Disneyland for a graduation trip, and it was his birthday on the day of his death. Philip and a friend of his were intoxicated, and they both decided to sneak into the cast members only area, and they would steal an inflatable rubber maintenance motorboat to drive it around the river for a joyride. However, the two would lose control of the boat, and they would end up crashing the boat onto a rock near Tom Sawyer's Island. Philip was thrown into the water. His friend traveled back to shore to seek help from the park staff. However, Philip was already drowned when they found his body. The victim's mother would sue the park and the travel agency for not properly supervising the teenagers. Both cases were dismissed by the jury. On January 3, 1984, Dolly Young, who was a 48-year-old woman visiting from Fremont, California, was riding the Matterhorn. During some time on the ride, Dolly's seatbelt became undone, and she was thrown out of the bobsled onto the tracks below. An incoming bobsled decapitated her and killed her instantly as her head and chest became pinned beneath its wheels. Since Dolly was sitting in the back of the bobsled, none of the passengers noticed her fall out of the ride. An investigation found that Dolly's seatbelt was not fastened at the time of her accident. The track section of where Dolly was struck and killed earned its nickname Dolly's Dip, and when cast members are required to walk the tracks when the ride shuts down, they can allegedly hear the ghost of Dolly. On September 14, 1985, Jennifer Reed, a 7-year-old girl who was visiting the park with her uncle, who was looking for his car in the parking lot of the park. Jennifer fell under a moving charter bus and was crushed by its wheels. When paramedics arrived at the scene, Jennifer was pronounced dead. On the early midnight hours on March 8, 1987, after the park closed, the second homicide at the park would occur at the parking lot. Celesi Tai, a 15-year-old boy, was involved in a confrontation between rival Samoan and Tongan gang members. The confrontation began getting heated when the rivals began shouting at each other, and then it would eventually turn into a brawl. 18-year-old Keleti Naea would pull out a gun and shoot Celesi several times in the back. Celesi was transported to UC Irvine Medical Center, where he would die from his injuries. In 1989, Keleti was charged with second-degree murder and was sentenced to 17 years in prison. On September 3, 1994, the first person would take their own life at the Disneyland Resort. A 75-year-old man jumped to his death from the 9th floor of the Bonita Tower at the Disneyland Hotel. 2 years later, another person would take their own life at the Disneyland Hotel on July 6, 1996. David Daigle, a 23-year-old state prison parolee who was released from a halfway house, would enter the hotel. David climbed over several balconies at the hotel before he would jump from the 14th floor of the Disneyland Hotel to his death. David wasn't a registered guest at the hotel. On December 24, 1998, Luan Dawson, a 33-year-old man who was a senior computer programmer at Microsoft, was traveling with his wife and family from Duvall, Washington. Luan and his family were waiting to board the Columbia ship. The ship was approaching too fast towards the dock. Cast member Christine Carpenter was unaware that the helmsman was planning to overshoot the dock. Christine anyways attached the mooring line to the cleat on the ship's bow. The problem was that the bolts that secured the metal cleat tore loose, and then it detached from the ship's bow, which flinged the 8-pound metal cleat into the crowd. The cleat projectile first struck Christine in the ankle, and then it struck Luan in the face and neck, which tore apart his jaw, and his wife Lu Vuong was also struck in the face, which left both paralyzed. The couple were transported to the UCI Medical Center, where Luan would die from his injuries 2 days later, after being taken off life support, while Lu would spend a whole year to undergo multiple surgeries to have the side of her face repaired from the accident. It was found that the normal tie line, a hemp rope that's designed to break easily, was improperly replaced by a cheaper elastic rope, which stretched and tore off the cleat from the ship's wooden hull. Disney admitted fault for the incident and settled for an undisclosed amount estimated to be around $25 million. Disney was also fined by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for $12,500 for improper training of Christine Carpenter, who wasn't trained to work at the Columbia attraction. On June 25, 2000, Cristina Moreno, a 23-year-old woman from Barcelona, Spain, was traveling with her husband to California for their honeymoon. The couple decided to spend a day at Disneyland, in which they decided to ride the Indiana Jones adventure attraction. Once the ride was over, Christina was complaining of suffering from a severe headache when she got off. The couple decided to return to their hotel in Hollywood. Later on in the evening, Christina was hospitalized at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where it was discovered she had a brain hemorrhage, and she was transferred back to Spain in an air ambulance. Christina would never recover from her brain hemorrhage, and she died on September 1st, 2000 from a cerebral aneurysm. The Moreno family filed for a lawsuit against Disney, saying that her death was caused by the violent shaking and stresses imposed by the ride. However, attorneys stated that the attraction was safe and that Christina's death was unrelated to the attraction. Disney settled for an undisclosed amount as a result. On September 22, 2000, Brandon Zucker, a 4-year-old boy who was traveling with his family from Santa Clarita, California. The family chose to ride Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin before the park would close for the day. While on the ride, Brandon would fall out of the cab, where he would get dragged and crushed underneath the cab. This caused serious internal injuries, which included a torn diaphragm, liver, and spleen. Brandon went into a cardiac arrest, and he suffered from permanent brain damage as a result of the accident. Although Brandon survived the accident, he wouldn't be able to walk and speak again for the rest of his life, and he was placed in a drug-induced coma for more than a month. On October 7, 2000, Disney changed its emergency policy to instruct ride operators to call 911 first, instead of the Disney Security Center. An investigation found that the lap bar malfunctioned and that Brandon was sitting in the wrong seat in the cab. Sometime after the accident, the Zucker family sued Disney, and eventually in 2002, the case was settled somewhere between $20 million and $30 million. Brandon would never fully recover from his injuries, and 8 years later, on January 26, 2009, Brandon died from his injuries at the age of 13. On April 22, 2003, Christopher Bowman, a 36-year-old stage technician, was testing special effects for the stage version of Aladdin at the Hyperion Theater while on a catwalk. Chris fell 42 feet and was severely injured and was hospitalized. After this accident, this prompted an investigation by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, where it was discovered that Christopher wasn't provided with a safe work platform and he wasn't wearing a properly certified safety harness. Christopher never regained consciousness and died from his injuries on May 18, 2003. Disney was fined $18,350 by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for safety violations in October 2003. On September 5, 2003, Marcelo Torres, a 22-year-old man, was traveling with a friend of his on the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad coaster. Marcelo and his friend were sitting in the front of the train. While the ride was in motion, 2 bolts from the coaster's left wheel came loose and fell off the cart, which caused an axle to jam into the railroad's ties, and then the locomotive nosedived and struck the top of the tunnel. The sudden force snapped a tow bar connecting the train to the front passenger cart, which crashed into the locomotive's undercarriage, which fell on and crushed Marcelo fatally. The crash injured 10 other guests as well. An investigation found that the cause of the accident was by improper maintenance of the train. Disney accepted responsibility for the accident and settled for an undisclosed amount with the Torres family. On May 2, 2008, John Newman Jr., a 48-year-old man who was staying at the Disneyland Hotel for a business trip, Newman decided to take his own life by jumping off from the 14th floor of the Wonder Tower. Newman fell to his death onto the parking lot below. On October 17, 2010, Ghassan Trabolsi, a 61-year-old man, took his own life by jumping off from the top floor of the Mickey and Friends parking structure. Ghassan left behind a note which cited personal issues for the reason why he decided to end his own life. On April 2, 2012, Christopher Tran, a 23-year-old man, fell to his death from the Mickey and Friends parking structure. It was suspected Christopher took his own life, however there were no witnesses who saw him jump off the parking structure. On November 26, 2016, sometime after 2 a.m., Brandon Quigley, a 40-year-old man, jumped to his death from the Mickey and Friends parking structure. Paramedics arrived and rushed Brandon to the UC Irvine Medical Center, where he would be pronounced dead at 3:08 a.m. The Mickey and Friends parking structure would be the site of 3 Disneyland deaths in a row for the past 6 years. On August 29, 2019, Javier Jimenez, a 37-year-old construction worker who was working in a trench near an employee entrance to Disneyland, was fatally injured when a steel plate fell on him. Javier went into a cardiac arrest, and he was rushed to a nearby hospital where he would later die from his injuries. On August 22, 2021, Joanne Aguilar, a physically disabled 66-year-old who was with her 2 adult daughters, went on the Jungle Cruise. However, a wheelchair-accessible boat wasn't available at the moment. Joanne was told by cast members she could still ride the attraction despite her disability. Once the ride was over, Joanne's daughters assisted her on helping her get out of the boat. While exiting the boat, she would lose her balance and fell back onto the boat and fractured her femur on her right leg. Joanne was taken to a hospital, and 10 days later she was moved to a rehabilitation center where she would stay there for 5 months after the incident until her death. Joanne got an infection and went into septic shock and died on January 29, 2022. The Aguilar family would file a lawsuit against Disney, alleging that cast members were giggling at Joanne's struggles, which left her embarrassed and ashamed. Disney responded stating that Joanne's injuries were caused by her own negligence, and they didn't discriminate or deny her equal access. As of this upload, the lawsuit is still ongoing between the Aguilar family and Disney. On December 3, 2022, Chris Christensen, a 51-year-old principal at Newland Elementary School, would take his own life by jumping off the top floor of the Mickey and Friends parking structure. Christopher was accused of child endangerment and battery charges after he got arrested last month, and he was due to appear in court on December 5th at 11:38 p.m. Christopher wrote one last lengthy Facebook post before he would take his own life on that very night. 2 months later, another similar incident took place on February 18, 2023. Marnie Schoenfeld, a 46-year-old hairstylist from Scottsdale, Arizona. Marnie jumped off the Mickey and Friends parking structure and she was severely injured at the scene. Paramedics rushed her to a nearby hospital where she would be pronounced dead from her injuries. As of making this video, these were the 28 people who lost their lives at the Disneyland park.